After the demise of her husband and dive buddy, an experienced diver returned to diving in the Four Sharks Blue Hole in the Bahamas. But while exiting the cave with her dive buddy, she got caught in a loose guideline in a narrow restriction. The only hope is for her to be freed before her gas runs out. Four Shark Blue Hole is a seaside ocean blue hole located inside the barrier reef, along the fault line 3 miles northwest of Dolly Cays, South Andros. It's known as one of the biggest caves in the Bahamas. To get inside, you'll first see a basin with coral around it, and it's about 33 feet deep. People also call it Kalik Cavern. This cavern is quite long, measuring 230 feet from one end to the other. It's also wide at about 66 feet, and it goes to a depth of 197 feet. If you go down to about 130 feet, you'll find a narrow crack. This crack goes even deeper, all the way down to a part of the rift that's between 164 and 344 feet, or maybe even deeper. The bottom part of the entrance is covered in sand and fine white silt. When the tide is very strong, the water from the reef mixes with the water inside the cave. 55-year-old May Edward was born for the deep waters. She had logged more than 500 dives within a few years. Those who knew her could see she was always looking forward to the next cave diving adventure. Growing up as a fisherman's daughter, she had always seen the deep waters as an intricate part of her life. She always made sure to let people know that she felt a sense of peace whenever she was in the water. May had dived in over 20 caves, and it was in one of her dives that she met her late husband, Bernard. Bernard was a professional support diver, and they were the perfect team. However, he met an unfortunate demise, and this broke May's heart. She stopped diving for over 3 years. Finally, she decided to go back and find peace in the depths of the water. So she set her sights on the Four Sharks Blue Hole and got in touch with one of her dive friends, Dre Sebastian. Dre was also a friend of her husband Bernard, but he was not sure that she was ready for the dive in the Blue Hole because she had been away for so long, but she convinced him and he finally agreed. They got with 2 support divers, who were Paul and Diego. On that fateful morning at 8:30 a.m., May, Dre, and the support divers arrived at the dive site. The plan was to dive to a depth of 250 feet. For this dive, they planned to stage mixed gas and oxygen cylinders at a depth of 30 feet for decompression. Another set of mixed gases were at a depth of 120 feet in the main cavern. Then when they got to 175 feet, they would switch their breathing gas after exhausting 1/3 of it to a trimix cylinder. Finally, during their ascent, they would switch back to compressed air at the 220-foot depth. So having gone over the dive plan again, they began their dive around 9 a.m. They started with compressed air and left their mixed gas and oxygen cylinders close to the entrance of the cave at a depth of 30 feet as planned. They made their descent through the huge main hall to a rift at the back of the cavern, about 300 feet away from the entrance and at a depth of about 120 feet, where they staged 2 more mixed gas cylinders for decompression when exiting the cave. The rift is a broad vertical fracture about 2 feet wide at its entrance, with a differing width of 2 to 20 feet as you dive deeper. No one knows what the depth of this cavern really is. There's a permanent guideline in the cave, which they used all through their dive. They continued their dive down the rift, passing through a 30-foot-long restriction until they got to about 175 feet using the permanent guideline. There was another restriction at this point too, but after it was a bigger passageway. Just as they planned, after exhausting 1/3 of their breathing gas, they switched to a trimix cylinder. When they got to the end of the fixed guideline at 12 minutes, May had to tie a new reel so they could proceed with their dive. The passageway at this depth was about 15 to 20 feet wide, but they couldn't see any sign of its bottom. They tied off the line and began to exit the cave 27 minutes into their dive. They continued surveying as they dived back to the end of the permanent line. During the survey, Dre realized that one of his trimix cylinders was leaking and the gas had been exhausted, so he continued diving using his other cylinder. Upon getting to the permanent line, they both began their ascent, following the line. Based on their plan, they were supposed to switch back to compressed air at 220 feet. But Dre soon ran out of trimix because he was only using one cylinder, so their plan was altered. He had no choice but to switch to air at 250 feet instead of 220 feet, where May made her own. At this point in their ascent, Dre was leading the dive in single file as they passed beneath a boulder and ascended to a depth of about 180 feet. Suddenly, Dre felt uneasy because of the air leakage and switched to air quite early. He was left with 265 psi in his air cylinder. So all that was on his mind was not to waste any more time so he could get to the decompression tank, which they had earlier staged at a depth of 120 feet in the main cavern. He had assumed that May was following closely behind. He pulled himself through the narrow passageway and then to his decompression tank. After breathing from the tank, he suddenly realized that he had not seen May. He turned back but could see no sign of her. So he shone his light and was shocked to see that the narrow passageway he had passed was getting silted out. What could have happened, he wondered. He shone his flashlight into it and looked for May. He waited for a few minutes, hoping to see May emerge from the rift, but there was no sign of anyone coming out of the hollow cave. With his anxiety building up, he dived into the restriction and found May entangled within the narrow passageway. Her dive tanks had been badly caught in a loose guideline, and in a bid to free herself, she kicked up silt, and the visibility was greatly reduced. Dre quickly went into action, trying to free her, but she had been badly tangled. Looking at her, he could see fear in her eyes. He tried his best to assure her that all would be okay, even though he knew she was in a terrible situation. Seeing that he was not getting anywhere with freeing her, he told her he would get help from the support divers. May held his hand firmly, not wanting him to leave, but he made her realize that the only way forward was to get help. Reluctantly, she let go of his hand, and he made her promise not to panic and kick up more silt until he was back with the support divers. He then dived into the cavern and rapidly waved his flashlight to get the attention of the support divers, Paul and Diego. Finally, he got their attention and hand-signaled that May had been caught in the narrow passageway. The divers quickly followed his lead, but on getting there, the whole section was silted out. They realized that there was no way that any of them could pass the tight restrictions to save May in such a situation, especially since they were low on air. Dre looked on with a broken heart, and the thought of how scared and helpless May was further broke his heart. He knew her air would soon run out, and she would soon breathe her last. There was nothing anyone could do to save her. They had to make their ascent and save themselves. Later that evening, some professional rescue divers arrived at the dive location, but the visibility had not improved. They came back the next day and located May's lifeless body, still entangled in the narrow passageway. It took them 3 days before they could finally free her. We would like to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching, take a dive on the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting cave diving story.